Well, I just have to mention, I'm glad that I don't drink alcohol anymore, because the carpet in the hallways, in the corridors, it was very dizzying to me, so I'm glad I'm on level ground here. So we're facing the east, David told me, the producer told me, so that's how we start. So I'll say some words that I've been taught to introduce myself. And but first I want to thank the girl drum from Alexander Mackenzie School this morning for starting us in a good way. I want to thank Shelley Charles for her words this morning, miigwech. Anibo Jo, Benezi Dijnakas, Wajesh Dodo Manashnabak, Angwaro Dodo Modnashoni, Alderville Donjiba, North Bay and Dayan, Anashnabak, Mississauga, and Dow. So I've said my clan, I've said the name I've been given, and I'm very privileged because my grandfather Moses Muskrat Marsden was the chief at Alderville. I'm very grateful to the Mississauga people for allowing us to meet on their territory, and for a good purpose to further the work of educators like yourself. So, miigwech.
Hi, thank you for having us, to the organizers, and I'm from a family of relative newcomers to Canada, so settlers. I grew up in Calgary, actually in a community that bordered on Tsuut'ina First Nation. I took skating lessons on the First Nation, but I didn't manage to visit another First Nation until I was Chief Commissioner, when I had the opportunity to visit Mississaugas of the New Credit. So in many ways, I'm pretty new at this, the reconciliation journey. And I'm here with Maurice because actually I was asked to keynote this presentation by myself and to talk about reconciliation. And I asked the organizers if I could actually include my dear friend and a former commissioner, Maurice Switzer, mostly because I think when you talk about reconciliation, we should model reconciliation when we have those conversations. And I think building on some of what was said earlier, you know, making space for people with lived experience who know way more about this than I do to share the stage and actually to guide the conversation is part of what I've learned as being really important as we start to talk about reconciliation. So I think I'm going to ask Maurice the first question, and it really draws from this idea that, and maybe we should move to our next
we'll move
position.
to our spot, yeah.
We're not very good at this.
No,
We've really rehearsed, but you have to forgive us if we're a bit wooden in our moving around the stage. So reconciliation, obviously it's become a real buzzword, and I think what's really resonated with me is just trying to really deconstruct that word to just realize that it just means having a real relationship. And so I guess my first question to you, Maurice, is what does a real relationship look like between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people? What are the qualities of that relationship?
Well, and again, I think the response that Renu gave to the organizers of this event, and we really appreciate people who are taking their time out being here as well as the time to organize it. I think her response to that invitation was reconciliation in action. Nothing about us without us. That's a good motto. And I appreciate very much Renu's understanding of it. Reconciliation, Senator Murray Sinclair talks about the importance of just having conversations, and not one-way conversations anymore, not just talking to us, but listening to what we say. Like when we say that we didn't come across the Bering Strait, or when we say that we didn't get our name because Christopher Columbus thought he was in India, like listen to us. So conversations are a good part of it. But learning about us, and this is the work that you're involved with, is the educational piece, and it's really important that people learn about it. We're a huge part of this country's history, and we still are a big part of this country's history. We are, and at one point I wanted to talk about the good things and the not so good things that are going on in education. History is wonderful, but we're still here, and we're not extinct. We didn't go away, as some people thought, or maybe even hoped we would. So learning about us is so important. But then you get to that piece, and I'm so pleased to meet Dr. Avis Glaze. She used the word implementation earlier. And I told her that one of the great Anishinaabe contemporary leaders named formerly Grand Chief Patrick Madabi said in any great initiative there has to be perspiration, inspiration, and implementation. And it's the implementation that somehow Canada is falling short. We have treaty rights that are held sacred in our Constitution, but they're not being implemented. So it's those three things I would say constitute reconciliations: the conversation, the learning, and then the implementation, doing something about it. So,
Great.
When I first was asked to consider being a commissioner, and it was a great privilege, and I'm so glad still to be involved. I was pleasantly surprised that before I got on board the commission, that in developing their strategic plan, they had 4 prongs: criminal justice, education, poverty/homelessness, I guess, and Indigenous reconciliation. I was delighted that was part. And I want to ask Renu about that, about what role she sees for the commission and what does reconciliation mean to the Ontario Human Rights Commission?
So I guess we're supposed to move.
Oh, we will.
I have a feeling I'm going to have to bring you along on this one, Maurice. It's so funny that you say that, actually, because I don't think I knew what reconciliation meant when we prioritized reconciliation. I think I knew that the TRC report had just come out and that there was a real moment and that our institution should be part of that moment. But I think that was only the beginning. And when I think of reconciliation, it wasn't any of the things I thought it was when we started. So I think when we started, it was a lot like what we think about as equity work. I thought it was about lifting Indigenous people up so they could be equal to other people in our society. And I think what I realized along the way is that's not what it's really about at all. And I think the first learning I had was exactly what Maurice said. It's just recognizing the role your institution has played in colonialism. So I remember at the first speech I wanted to give to a primarily Indigenous audience, I had written that I wanted to acknowledge that the Human Rights Code is colonial. And my team just kind of was like, you cannot say this publicly. You're the Human Rights Commissioner. Your whole mandate centers on the code. How could you start by undermining our very statutory foundation? And I said, but the code is colonial, isn't it? It doesn't even protect Indigenous people explicitly. They don't even get explicit protection in the Human Rights Code. They either have to qualify as a race or as having particular ancestry. So I sort of went out and did that, and lo and behold, the sky didn't fall. And in fact, so many people came up to me after and just said, wow, that was really brave to acknowledge that the Human Rights Code hasn't really protected us. And if it had, we wouldn't see the kinds of outcomes we see today. And then from there, I think, was a real, I think when you believe in equity and human rights, you think that you're a good person. And so you think that everyone just why don't we all believe in human rights? And I never really understood why Indigenous people didn't really connect with human rights. And I think what it made me realize is that human rights is premised on a very Western worldview. The worldview is we have this all-powerful state, and the state gives you some rights that you get to cash in every so often. And Indigenous people are like, no, it's like we're all interdependent. There isn't some all-powerful entity that grants you rights. So when you tell us we have rights, we're like, no, thank you. We'd rather have our society that's interdependent and holistic. And so it took me a long time to understand this disconnect between the human rights framework and Indigenous people. And I think from that disconnect, I really started to think about what is our role then? If the human rights paradigm isn't maybe always the right paradigm, what do we do because we are a human rights institution? And I'll kind of leave it at that, but I think that
ushered in a lot of self-reflection about what our role should be in this larger conversation about reconciliation, and realizing that actually if we listened to Indigenous people, people like Maurice, other people, commissioners and elders, that they would help us understand the answer, that we didn't actually have to develop it. All we had to do was listen. Okay, yes, sorry, and I just stepped on your... Okay, so back to you. Maurice, you know, we have these beautiful, but most importantly, important wampum belts, and you talk a lot about the treaty relationship, and I know that's been a focus of your work. So what is so important about the treaty relationship that has made you want to really focus on that as in this moment of reconciliation?
It's been a great learning journey for me, and I'm so lucky to have had teachers, and some of them are in this, I don't know whether they're in the room, but they're in the building. Is Alan Corbier here? What a wonderful teacher Alan Corbier has been for people like me who are learning about the importance of the wampum belts and treaties. And these belts are here because I've been taught they hear everything that's said in their presence. So, so you're being recorded. These are mnemonic devices. And if you look at the image, and it will be, if it hasn't already in those loop photos, have they shown the wampum belts in the loop yet? Or if you can see the image in the center, it's of two people holding hands, and the treaty relationship on which was based the peaceful settlement of this country that you call Canada was based on that relationship of two people holding hands as equals, not as subject and master or sovereign, as equals. And when people want to see what does, and already a few people have said, well, I'm not sure what reconciliation means or what does it look like. I tell people that picture in the woven into that wampum belt of two people holding hands, that's what reconciliation looks like. And I show that belt to literally hundreds and hundreds of school children of all ages. They get it. They understand exactly what that means. So that's important to all of us. Oh, I'll ask a question by a show of hands. How many people in here have treaty rights? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6,
I'm going to
7,
give you
8,
a
9,
hint.
10. I count fewer than 20.
Yeah.
Who do you think we made the treaties with? We didn't make them with ourselves. Everybody in here has treaty rights. You're responsible, as am I, as a treaty person, for making sure that those promises that were made are fulfilled. And you should be proud. The difference between Indigenous peoples and everybody else is that most of you have had your treaty rights acknowledged and recognized. The fact that this school is on someone else's land, this building, I should say, this hotel, that your schools are on someone else's land, that you have infrastructure like roads and schools and hospitals and gas stations and banks.
And clean water.
And clean water. That means that your treaty rights have been recognized. How many First Nations now in Canada can't trust their drinking water? So we all have treaty rights. My job is to make sure that yours are upheld, as well as your job is to make sure that mine are upheld. So that relationship is critical to where we all are. And the treaties are not ancient documents, although like these ones, they may have been, and I never say sign because you can't sign something if you can't read or write that language, but they trusted the words that were promised to them, that these treaties would last, these agreements would last as long as the sun rises in the east. That's a long time. When it stops coming up, don't worry about treaties. That'll be the least of our worries, you know. On the basis of those promises and accepting those promises, the real nation building started in Canada. It wasn't 100 years later when those English guys with powdered wigs had three-corner sandwiches and tea or sherry in Charlottetown or Quebec City. That's not when Canada started. 1764 July, that's when Canada started. That's what made Canada reality. So that's why, to me, the treaty relationship is just, it's paramount. It's fundamental to everything that exists here. And when people say, as do some Indigenous peoples, well, doesn't it bother you that all those promises have been broken? Why should we even bother teaching about it? Well, I can tell you, and there may be some lawyers in here, from a legal perspective, it's far better to have a broken promise than never have a promise at all. You can litigate a broken promise. So, thank you, Renu, for asking that. We better move. We better move. Speaking of water, let me take an aside. I haven't heard anybody acknowledge yet what's at the center of our circle.
Water.
So I encourage you, whatever you're teaching, whether you're teaching about the people of the four directions, and I say we're all part of the human race, we have different colors, but there's one race, the human race. Whatever you're teaching in your schools, please teach about the importance of what's in those glasses. Because we can't survive without that. So I hope that environmental teaching is a critical part of whatever is in your curriculum, whether it's Indigenous studies or biology or botany or science. So I wanted to ask, the province of British Columbia has created quite a stir by announcing a week or two ago that they were going to implement within all of their legal framework in that province the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And I know that Renu has made that front and center in the work that the Ontario Human Rights Commission is doing. So I'd like her to elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, so I told you how I was very confused about what the role of the commission was if it wasn't to uphold the human rights in the code for Indigenous people. And what we decided to do to kind of answer that question was we brought together about, 30 or 40 Indigenous leaders. And when I say leaders, I don't just mean political leaders, I mean grassroots leaders, elders, international leaders. We had James Anaya, who had been the former UN Special Rapporteur on the rights of Indigenous people, come. And we had a 3-day dialogue where we asked that question: what is the role of the Human Rights Commission in this world of reconciliation? And I will say that at the end of the first day, I had lost the thread on the conversation. I didn't know what people were talking about. I didn't know how it related to our mandate. And, my team was like, this event is it was the exact opposite of this event, which is very coordinated. It had gone totally off, and people were talking about all sorts of things that I didn't understand. And at one point, our team said, I think we need to move it back on track. And I said, you know what, let's just let it play out for a bit. And actually, I think it was Maurice who said to me, what's happening right now is when you let Indigenous people lead, we all know what we're talking about. You're just the person who doesn't understand. And that's how we sometimes feel when we come into Western spaces where everyone seems to get it and we don't really get it. Just let it keep going, you'll get there. So at the end of day 3, we had gone on this real journey. And I think at the end of the journey, what I heard loud and clear was, you need to use the UN Declaration as a way of bridging these worldviews between Western worldviews around human rights and Indigenous worldviews. And that the UN Declaration speaks to our experiences, it speaks to how we frame rights as being collective in nature. And the goal, what the Human Rights Commission now needs to do is figure out how do we use the Human Rights Code, our provincial legislation, as a mechanism to implement the rights in the UN Declaration. So obviously that's a very difficult task, but I think what's so exciting about it is it's allowed us to bring together Indigenous people to help guide the Commission in how to do that work. And things that have come up are, how do we talk about environmental protection as a human rights issue that particularly impacts Indigenous people? And I think it's allowed us to see that when we actually allow Indigenous people to frame what human rights means to them, it leads you in a totally different place than I think where we would have got to had we tried to puzzle through this all by ourselves. I think the other thing that was really a big learning lesson for me is just that you sometimes have to take a bit of a leap of faith and trust that other people will get you and guide you to where you need to be. And what's so ironic is that in this process where we were really exploring the limits of the Human Rights Code, what has happened is more and more Indigenous people have reached out to me directly to use our existing legislation to uphold their rights. So people now call me and say, you know, there's this human rights issue that I never would have thought of bringing to the tribunal, but maybe actually it is justiciable. What do you think? So I guess it's that in kind of ceding a bit of control over our kind of Western worldview about human rights, we've just created space for Indigenous people to find their own place in that system. And I think we're now working as allies rather than seeing the commission as kind of leading the work. Rather, I think we're being led in this work, which is really different from the work we do often with other communities. Okay. We're back to, we're going to go around twice. Maybe.
Do we have any questions? Do you have any questions?
I have a question for you
Okay.
still. One more.
One more.
Okay. I think that you have a real insight traveling across the province, being in classrooms, about, at a really practical level, like what are teachers doing that you find inspiring, that you think, wow, this is what reconciliation needs to look like? And then maybe on the more uncomfortable, difficult side, what are you seeing that you think may not be the most productive kind of way of approaching these issues?
Well, I'm glad we have a few minutes to talk about teachers. The most important people in my life, even including parents and grandparents, have been teachers. I get really angry when I hear people who are of, let's say, a small c conservative persuasion be very dismissive of the importance of educators. Maybe I'm just lucky that I've had so many good teachers. I don't know, but I'm pretty lucky. I was listening to Gabrielle's keynote this morning, and when I think of it was my kindergarten teacher was Miss Elsie Kidd. I still can picture her face. I can picture how she was so amazing to draw with colored chalk, all these wonderful things on the blackboard, and we did have blackboards then. There weren't dinosaurs, but there were blackboards. I remember Andy Harris, who was my first high school teacher that introduced me to contemporary Canadian poetry, as well as the importance of understanding Shakespeare. And I'm so lucky to have had people who've had that influence in my life. And as Gabriel said, it's not just the knowledge, that they weren't just stuffing knowledge into me. That wasn't their goal. Their goal was to try to inspire their students and to encourage us. So I'm lucky that I've met so many people who are doing that in classrooms. I'm very lucky. I enjoy that. And I see, I mentioned a bit earlier that I wish there wasn't quite as much emphasis on the historic aspect of Indigenous peoples in Canada. I would like to see more reference to role models, Indigenous role models, achievers. The federal government used to have a wonderful program called the Aboriginal Role Model Program, where actually there were a team of people who were achievers in all fields that used to go around and visit schools. I think that was canceled probably in a very dark decade that I won't talk about in Canadian political history. But there's a book that I've used. It's called I think it's called the Encyclopedia of Native American Contributions. I think you can get an online version as well as a hard copy. You know, the things that Indigenous peoples have contributed is amazing. And we have achievers in almost every field you can think of. I was so pleased, Troy Miracle told me last night that the director of your board is a First Nations man. What's his name?
Sean Monteith.
Sean Monteith. Can you imagine that? How many school boards in Ontario? 72? We have a director. In North Bay, where I live, we have the first president of a standalone Canadian university, Dr. Michael de Gagne. who was formerly chair of the Aboriginal Healing Commission. So these things are starting. Those are role models. Gabrielle said she was the first person in her family to go to post-secondary education. I remember when it was a big thing in many of our communities for someone to graduate from high school. Look at when I went to post-secondary school, again, there weren't dinosaurs, but I'm told I was one of 83 Indigenous students in Canada in post-secondary education. 83. Nipissing University, that shares a campus with Canadore College in North Bay, have 700 Indigenous students. 700. That's that's exponential growth. And because, as was mentioned earlier, we are going to be the workforce of the future. There are all sorts of economic opportunities as well as moral opportunities and ethical opportunities and human rights opportunities to address that. So I encourage you to keep doing the job you're doing. I told your York Board Director, Louise, this is a very difficult time. Many of your students are the first students in Canadian history to be taught these things in school. It's a big jolt to many of their parents, and I know some teachers have blowback from parents who, when their little girl comes home and the mom says or dad says, "Janie, what did you learn in school today?" "Well, I learned that 5,000 Native kids were forced to go to school and they died." What would you think if your little one came home and told you that? So try to be patient, but understand that these children that you're teaching, when they're parents, they won't have the same reaction when their kids come home and tell them those stories. You're on the leading edge of arguably the most major societal change in this country's history. Usually politicians do those things, but educators are being challenged to do it. So keep doing the work you're doing. Not all of your colleagues buy into it. Not all of your parents buy into it, but that's okay. Progress is like that. Nothing's 100%. So just keep doing the work you're doing, and I'll just give you, I don't want to use all our time, I'll just give you, if I can give free advice, remember free advice is worth what you pay for it. Don't be afraid of the subject, but don't pretend to know anything you don't know. That's it. Thanks for doing.
Thank you.
Is that it? Yeah?
Yeah, I think that's it. We used our time.